was 2:33. 4 men had been killed outright, and 2 others had died of wounds on the trail home. The rest had been surrounded and taken captive. For a few days the survivors had attempted to follow the Indians, till heavy snow had made it impossible to go on. They had found the scalped body of one of the captives lying by the trail, and they had little hope that in the weather any of the prisoners would have been spared. They had turned back and made their way on snowshoes, barely reaching Hadley before another blizzard set in. The sobered guests crowded close, waiting for one answer. No one on the Wethersfield men had been killed, but one of the captives was the young fellow who had been studying with the doctor, John Holbrook. In the mingled relief and horror, few of them noticed the faint wail that came from Judith, or saw her waver and fall. Kit and Rachel sprang forward, but it was William who reached her first, and carried her gently to the settle by the fire, and it was William who later tucked her carefully into the sleigh and drove her home. In the weeks that followed, watching Judith, Kit began to understand how the gray shadow that was her Aunt Rachel could once have been the toast of an army. Hopelessness had erased the color and animation from Judith's face, and set her lovely features into a still mask. Kit ached for her, but even more she was torn with pity for Mercy, whose grief could not find an outlet in a tear or word. Would Mercy's scant strength be equal to this burden? Rachel worried that her daughter did not gain, and fussed over the fire, concocting nourishing stews which Mercy obediently tried to swallow. In some contradictory way, grief seemed to have etched on Mercy's thin face a beauty it had never possessed. Behind the clear gray eyes the light still burned steadily. Should I tell her? Kit wondered. Surely now Mercy has a right to know that John loved her. But watching Mercy's stillness, she found a new patience to resist her own impulse. Some day the time would come when Mercy could know. The Christmas season passed, unmarked by any rejoicing. There was no holiday in this Puritan town, no feasting, no gifts. The day went by like any other, filled with work, and Kit said nothing, ashamed that in this somber household she should ever even remember a happy English Yuletide. January dragged by, and February. It was the hardest winter most of the townspeople could remember. Old people shook their heads, recalling blizzards of their childhood, but it was impossible for Kit to visualize anything more bleak than this first winter of her experience. She no longer saw any beauty in the world muffled in white. She hated the long days of imprisonment, when there was nothing to see through the window but shifting curtains of pale gray, when drifts stood waist-high on the doorstep, and it took hours of back-breaking labor to carve a passage to the well. She hated the draughty floors and frigid corners, and the perpetual animal reek of heavy clothes hung about the fireplace to dry. Every night she shrank from the moment when she and Judith must make the dread ascent to the upstairs chamber with only the meager comfort of a warming pan. But impatient as she was with the long days indoors, the outdoors promised only aching misery. She resented the arduous preparation for the journey to the meeting, and heavy leather boots, the knit socks drawn over them, the clumsy little foot stove they had to lug all the way, that cooled off long before the sermon was finished and left one to sit with stitching fingers and toes, while the breath of the whole congregation rose like the smoke from many pipes. How could Hannah have endured it? Kit often shivered alone in the cabin with the wind howling outside and no one to speak to for weeks on end but the cat and the goats. She hoped there was a cozy hearth at Nat's grandmother's house, and her own heart warmed at the thought of the 2 old ladies sharing it together. Then her restless thoughts would drift after the Dolphin. Nat had offered her to take her with him. Suppose she had accepted this offer. If she had never come back, would anyone here in this house really have cared very much? By now she would be in Barbados, and this very moment she might be, the broom in her hand or the treadle under her foot, would idle to a stop as she walked in imagination up the wide river to her grandfather's house, and stepped up to the long shady veranda. Then she would shake herself free. Such daydreaming was a weakness. The whole house was sold, and she was never here in New England, and perhaps Nat had never really meant his offer at all. One night she woke up from a vivid dream. She and Nat had stood side by side at the bow of the Dolphin, watching that familiar curving prow, carving gently through the calm turquoise water. They came soundless into a palm-studded harbor, fragrant with the scent of blossoms and happiness. It was like sunshine wrapping her round and pouring into her heart till it overflowed. She awoke in the freezing darkness. "I want to go back," she admitted at last, weeping. "I want to go home where green things are growing, and I will never see snow again as long as I live." Her tears scalding, her eyelids froze instantly against the pillow. Lying tense beside Judith, she made a resolve.